Hi, welcome to Candor Crafts. I just recently got into tabletop terrain making. This wood cabin is one of the first few pieces that I've made, and this is how I did it. I just used simple materials for this build: thin cardboard packaging, cardstock from a cake box, and a big handful of wooden stir sticks, as well as glue and paint, of course. I started on the base structure by squaring off a piece of cardboard and cutting it into two 2x4-inch pieces to make the front and back sides of the house. I also glued on some smaller pieces to fix and prevent warping. Next, I measured out one of the side pieces and added the roof shape. After cutting that out, I used that to outline the other side piece and made sure they were the same size. I glued the 4 pieces together and set it aside. I also used a battery pack that I had next to me to make sure that the walls were square while it dried. While waiting for that, I made the roof shingles. I cut up the cake box into strips, then into rough square shapes. No measuring, I just tried to keep them all relatively close in size, but not really. I did that till I felt like I had enough. When the structure was dry, I used it to mark out the size of one of the sides of the roof. Luckily, I already had a piece of cardstock that fit exactly the length of the house perfectly, so I only needed to mark the width of the roof. Then, I scored that with my blade so that I could just fold it and cut the other side to get the exact size that I would need. I glued that into place, left it to dry, and here's the basic shape of the house, on which I could build out the house's outer layers. But before that, I wanted to mark down where the windows and doors would go. I used paper cutouts to visualize the placement, as well as my little cardboard guy to make sure the scale of the door was right. I ended up scaling down the door a little bit just because it looked too big for a small cabin like this. Also, I used this guy for scale because I don't have any minis right now, so I just measured out and drew a little 28mm dude. Anyway, once I was happy with the size and placement, I used a cardboard template to outline everything, making sure that the door and the window on this side were aligned. Then I did the same with the 2 other windows on the back of the house. Now I could start on the roof shingles. I did the whole roof by just slathering on some white glue onto the roof base, then laying down the shingles row by row. I tried not to make it so even and deliberately used different sized tiles, while still keeping a natural looking offset pattern. But I was definitely fighting against my undiagnosed OCD here. I was mildly uncomfortable. For the ridge of the roof, I used larger pieces of cardstock and folded them in half, starting from each end, then meeting in the middle. After laying down the roof ridge, there was definitely one row on one side of the roof that was a little too thin, which literally made my skin crawl. So I decided to put the door on the other side of the house so that I wouldn't have to look at that row of roof shingles that often when it's on display. I decided to do my base coat at this point because the body of the house would be made out of wooden stir sticks, and I don't really paint those so much as just stain them, and that wouldn't work with a layer of base coat over the wood. So I mixed up a batch of Black Magic base coat and got to brushing over the whole thing. This base coat by Black Magic Craft is basically just Mod Podge with black paint in it, and I don't really do it the same way he does it. I like to put a little less black paint and add in some water as well, just so I don't have to keep dipping my brush into water every time. It does look gray when I first brush it on, but it dries into a sort of transparent black, which I kinda like. I also did the inside of the house for extra strength. This is where I realized that I made 2 not so huge but still kind of annoying mistakes. first, I had forgotten that I wanted a pipe chimney on the back side of the house. I was thinking about just rolling up a piece of cardstock to make the pipe, but then I remembered that I had this bamboo straw that my sister gave me and that I never used because it seemed highly unsanitary. Plus, it was the perfect size for the chimney. So I marked out the angle of the roof, then sawed off an appropriate length of straw. I cut out a piece of cardstock to act as the metal skirt for the chimney and glued both pieces onto the roof. The second thing I forgot was that once I glued the wood shingles onto the body of the cabin, it would add to the thickness of the walls, which meant that I had less overhang for the roof. So I added another row of shingles to each side of the roof. The chimney needed a cap, so I made one by cutting out a Pac-Man, then gluing the edges to make a wide cone shape, then glued that to the top of the chimney. I wanted to also paint up the roof before I moved on to the body, so I wouldn't have to be super careful to not get any paint on the wood, especially when I paint the underside areas. I start with a base of a dark terracotta-ish color that I mixed together. Then I overbrushed it with a crimson red. I did 2 layers of dry brushing, first with a raw sienna, then with a lighter mix of raw sienna and white. For the chimney, I started mixing up some gray, but then I remembered that I had some gray left over from a previous project. I then covered the gray with a silver paint and left it there for now. The washes can go on later once everything else is done. Moving on to the body, I started by putting the dividers on the front and back of the house and shaved it down so that it's flush with the bottom of the piece. I did this for all the sticks that would go on the cabin vertically. For all the rest of the stir sticks, I took my blade and roughened up the edges on one face of the stick so the shingled siding wouldn't have straight edges. I glued on the door first, then cut a few sticks in half lengthwise to make a door frame and the windows. I also added a trim along the bottom. At this point, the cabin is really starting to come together now that all the major details were on the piece. When I decided to make this cabin with wood shingled siding, I had to figure out what kind of material I wanted to use. My options were popsicle sticks or wooden stir sticks, so I made some test pieces and stained them as well. I decided on the stir sticks because they were more appropriate for the scale and they just generally looked better. Here you can see what I was talking about earlier. The edges on this sample were a bit too straight and uniform, and roughening up the edges of the sticks definitely helped with that on the final product. Speaking of which, it was time for the most tedious part of the project, laying on all of the wood shingles. I had to be very careful not to get any glue on the visible parts of the wood, because the glue would cause awkward unstained patches of wood later on. For the upper part on the sides of the house, I decided to place the sticks vertically just to give it more variance since there aren't any other details on the sides. This is the point where I started to get excited again, because now I just had to add in the final physical details. The important one was to hide the ends of the shingles. I did that by adding panels on each corner of the cabin, as well as the sides where the roof met the walls. I also added another layer of trim along the bottom so that the corner panels wouldn't have any awkward spaces. And one last plank to hide the seam where the horizontal shingles met the vertical planks. Next, the door bracing. Then, the middle frames on the windows. Finally, it was time to stain the wood. Now I say stain, but what I'm essentially doing is washing the wood with a watered down burnt umber. Once the stain was dry, I moved on to dry brushing with a light tan. You can really see the difference it makes. Now my favorite part of painting, the washes. This is just watered down black paint with a drop of dish soap, another recipe I learned from Black Magic Craft. I slathered that on everything. After everything was covered and relatively dry, I went back and layered on a more pigmented black wash on some areas where you might find water damage or dirt buildup. I did the same on the roof but dabbed it with tissue to make the wash look more splotchy. The chimney looked a bit too clean even with the grime on it, so I mixed up some rust color and messily streaked that onto the chimney with a small brush, alternating between the rust color and the black wash. I mixed up some moss color using a bright green and the black and brown washes, and applied that to any parts that might have some heavy water damage. While I was dry brushing the body, I got some paint on the inner part of the windows, so I blacked those out, then put on a layer of clear nail polish for the glass. I'm fully expecting that this might yellow and chip over time, and I'm fine with that, cause then it'd just add to the effect of the piece. The last tiny detail that I need to add is a door handle. I thought a rope door pull would look cute, so I made that with a bit of twine. The twine I have has a lot of frayed threads sticking out, so I secured all those by rubbing on watered down white glue. Before the glue dried, I made 2 knots at the length that I wanted the door pull to be and cut off the excess string on one end. When that dried, I stained it with the same brown wash I used for everything and dabbed the excess with a bit of tissue. I did the same with the black wash, then let it dry again. Now it's ready to go onto the door. I snipped off the rest of the excess rope, but this time I snipped it flush with the knot, and that's the end that will get glued onto the door. And that's that.